We're going to go ahead, and if you would take your Bibles and turn with me to Isaiah 53, and then we're going to be in Matthew in 26, Isaiah 53, and we'll also be in Matthew in 26. Of course, we're going to go through several passages, but we'll look here at the beginning part in Matthew 26 as well. Isaiah 53. And let's just notice here in verse 7, and we begin here, verse 7. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people was he stricken. And he made his grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see of the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. And by his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. Over 700 years before the coming of Jesus Christ, Isaiah prophesied and spoke of what Christ was to do and his suffering and death there on the cross. And we will find here in Matthew 26, and we notice, I want you to see in verse, let's look here in Matthew in 26, and let's look in verse 57. Verse 57. And they laid hold on Jesus and led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. This is just after Christ had prayed there in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he told Peter, James, and John to wait with him for an hour, to just simply watch with him as he prays. They couldn't even wait for an hour. They couldn't bear that. They all fell asleep. Jesus said that they had to watch and pray. The reality was that the spirit was willing, but the flesh was weak. And Christ knew that they would all forsake him. Even though Peter said, I'll never deny you. Oh, I'll stand with you, Jesus, till the end. And yet he did deny him. 3 times he denied Jesus Christ. And Christ knew what was coming. He even told his disciples over and over what was going to happen. They didn't really pay attention or listen because they still thought that Jesus was going to defeat the Romans and he was going to proclaim himself to be king of the Jews. But there's more to it. We understand, obviously, that the message there in Isaiah, over 700 years before, was that Christ came to bear the sins of those who would trust and believe in him, to redeem mankind from his sins. So we do notice at this point in time, it said that the disciples forsook Christ and fled, all of them, in fear and terror. Now, we need to understand, at the first part you're going to read in John, there's so many, the Gospels present in different ways. They don't contradict. They're harmonious. They're unified in what their message is. But some will present a little more of what has gone on. And of course, I find it so amazing when you go in John 18. We'll look in there later on. But when you go and you read about when Judas Iscariot goes to betray Jesus, and he goes there to the garden, and he brings a band of soldiers with him to betray and say, well, the one that I kiss on the cheek, he's the one that you ought to arrest. And what happens is that they go and they ask him, are you the one? Are you the Christ? And Christ says, I am he. I am he. And when he says that, it's very interesting because you'll read that everyone falls back. They fall back. The implication there, the power of Jesus Christ, even in the reality that they were coming to take him away, you understand Christ had all the power. He could have stopped it at any time. No one murdered Jesus, really. Jesus said, no man takes my life. I lay it down. So we see this happening. The disciples flee. Obviously, Peter does try. It's believed that he tries to put a stop or do some, when he takes the sword and he cuts Malchus' ear off. One of the ones that was with the soldiers. Jesus heals that one that was there, Malchus. And he tells Peter to put up his sword. And he tells him those who take the sword will perish with the sword. So then we see they lead Jesus away there to the high priest. And the scribes and the elders were assembled. And Peter followed him afar off from the high priest's palace and went in and sat with the servants to see the end. Now the chief priests and elders and all the council sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death. They had all their ducks in a row, by the way. You need to understand something about why they even took Jesus to Pilate, and we'll look at this later on. But again, they realized that if they were to try to do anything to Jesus, to try to stone him, because again, their law was that if they were going to seek to put him to death, they would do like Stephen, and they would stone Jesus to death. But it wasn't appointed for that, and if they would do that, his blood would be on their hands, and they would be the people, the crowds, would go against them. They didn't want to raise any kind of insurrection or any animosity towards them, so they said, well, let's get the Roman government to do that. Nobody really likes the Roman government, and let's try to get them. They can crucify him, and the reality is that when he's crucified, he is suffering a criminal death. Something that he's going to be looked upon as such a curse to the people. A horrible type of death. So we don't want people looking at us and implicating us and causing some kind of riot and protest. That's our job. By the way, they conspire. The Bible will speak about that they conspire together to do these things. And of course, most would have you believe that there's no conspiracies ever anymore, It's just called pre-planned policies. But we see here that they had all their ducks in a row. And though they tried, it says here, they had false witness against Jesus. They tried to put him to death, but found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came, yet found they none. And at the last came 2 false witnesses, and said, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. Now, Jesus was saying this in the reality that what was going to happen when he would die but rise again in 3 days. And the high priest arose and said unto him, what do you have to say for yourself? Answer thou nothing? What is it which these witnesses against thee? But Jesus held his peace. He said nothing. And the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure you by the living God that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. Just tell us plainly. Well, I think Jesus told them that many times. They didn't want to listen or believe. Jesus said unto them, thou hast said, nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter shall you see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Boy, there, he's coming again. And every eye will see him when he returns. He says, and you'll see the Son of Man coming in power. Well, they didn't like that. How dare you? Blasphemy! Blasphemy! And the high priest tore his clothes. And he said, oh, he's spoken blasphemy. The anguish this brought him. Do you really think the high priest cared to? No. But it's all a show. It's all an act. It's all something to cause people to be stirred up and angry. And he says, oh, he's spoken blasphemy. What further need have we? We don't need any more witnesses. Yes, we tried to present all this evidence and we couldn't find anything. But boy, look what he said. That was a terrible thing. Now let's seek to have him crucified. And then they said, what think ye? And they answered and said, he is guilty of death. He's guilty of death. So what did they do? Well, they did what any good justice system would do, and they beat him and spit in his face and ridiculed and mocked. I'm being sarcastic in that. But we see what happens here. They beat him and they smack him with the palms of their hands. And they say, tell us, Jesus, tell us, Christ, if you are. Who's the one that hit you? Who's the one that smote you? So then we're going to find this is the time when Peter, as he's seeing what's happening with Christ, then he ends up later on denying Jesus those 3 times. But But I want you to notice what they do here. It says in chapter 27 and verse 1, when the morning was come, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. Again, here they are. They're taking their consultation. They're conspiring to have him killed. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. And then Judas, which had betrayed him, when he saw that he was condemned, repented himself and brought again the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders. Of course, they didn't care. And Judas was not sorrowful in repentance. Judas was sorrowful for what was happening, but he ended up killing himself in the end of his betrayal. But I want you to see what happens when they take Jesus to Pilate. Look with me here. We're going to read in Luke in chapter 23. Luke 23. Luke in chapter 23, and also in John, we'll notice. They berate Jesus, they mock, they ridicule, and then they end up taking him to Pilate. They've got to, again, like I say, they already know that the best way for them to go about making sure none of the people, none of the crowds would go against them. Because again, if they tried to stone Jesus, if they did anything, boy, there would be a massive insurrection, there would be anger, there would be animosity towards them. So they have to use the Roman government to do this. And here we have Pilate, who was, in a sense, a judge over that area, and they bring him to Pilate. He was the 6th Roman procurator of Judea at that time. And so they take him there, and we see here in Luke 23. It says in verse 1, and the whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation. Now again, what do you have to do? In order to try to build your case, you have to get the most outlandish part first. You have to have the biggest thing first. Oh, you've got to understand, he's wrecking everything. Don't you remember in Acts what they said about the Christians? They said, these people have turned the world upside down. The media doesn't do that, do they? You got to take the biggest narrative, the biggest thing, and you've got to present it before, even if it sounds so outlandish, so insane. You put it there. And so they did. And they said, here he is, he's perverting the nation, he's corrupting all. And he forbids to give tribute to Caesar. He's not telling people, he's trying to cause people to go against the Roman government. You've got to understand that. He's telling people not to pay their tax. That's not what Jesus said. In fact, they were angry. They tried to get Jesus to say, you can't do this. When they came and they said, who do we pay tribute to? Who do we pay tribute? Do we pay tribute to Caesar, to God? And what did Jesus say? He said, render to God the things that are God's, and to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And they couldn't ensnare him because you had here the law of Rome and the teaching of Judaism. But we notice as we go on, they say that, well, he forbids to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And so Pilate asked him and said, art thou the king of the Jews? And he answered and said, thou sayest. And then said Pilate to the chief priests and the people, I find no fault in this man. And they were the more fierce, saying, he stirs up the people. So what do you do when you don't believe the narrative? What do you do when you don't have the news there? You have to continue to press, and you've got to be more vehement than ever. No, you don't understand. Oh, he really does do these things. They were so fierce about it, and they stirred up the people. Or he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place. And when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod. Now there's a lot more that happens with Pilate. We see what Luke records here, but I want you to notice we go on to John 18. Now, I know we're turning in different places, but I want you to see here the response of Pilate and what happens. Pilate has been thrown into this now. The Jews, again, they have to do these things. They have to try to force Pilate to do this and crucify Christ to get their way, to put a stop. They couldn't do it themselves. They were afraid of the people. But they said, we've got to get the Roman government involved in this. They can do it. And so they have all their ducks in a row. They conspire. They have false witnesses. And they also create a certain crowd of rioters to cry out later on to crucify him. That doesn't happen today, right? But we'll go on. John 18, and it says here in verse, let's notice. Look with me here in John 18, and we'll see in verse 28. Then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Now, notice the hypocrisy here. The hypocrisy of them. They would not come into this place here, it says. They didn't go into the judgment hall because they didn't want to be kind of equated there with it. It was customary. You don't go there, you would be unclean, and it was going to be the time of the Passover, the feast that you were going to partake in. And if they did that, they couldn't eat of the feast. So they were so worried and concerned about that. So you think about the hypocrisy here. Here they're trying to get one who's innocent, one who's blameless, one who has healed people, one who has spoken the truth, and yet they say, well, we can't go into the judgment hall. We might not be able to partake in the Passover. You know, mountains out of molehills, but that doesn't happen anymore either, right? Well, we go on. We see here that it says, Pilate then went out unto them and said, what accusation bring you against this man? And they answered and said, if he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him up to thee. You know, you've got to understand something. He's a thief. He's a liar. He's a crook. And if he wasn't so bad, if he wasn't a criminal, we wouldn't have brought him to you. But we're bringing him because he's such a terrible person. And Pilate said unto them, take ye him and judge him according to your law. Why can't you judge according to your law? They said, well, it's not lawful for us at this time to put a man to death. And that saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die. And then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again and called Jesus and said, art thou the King of the Jews? And Jesus said, sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it of me? And Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Thine own nation, the chief priests, have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? And you're going to notice the character of Pilate. This guy is very logical, rational. And it doesn't seem that he has much superstition and much belief of any kind of spiritual sense. Like the Jews, where they had superstitions and traditions that they held on to. Pilate does not. Yes, he's under the Roman government. Yes, they had millions of different idols. But again, it was almost like this idea that it was a moot point that didn't really even matter. So Pilate is being rational, and he says, what has he really done? And this is why over and over he says, I can't find fault in him. But the more that Pilate begins to speak to Jesus, the more he is intrigued. The more that he is shocked in the manner of what Jesus does. Because when the people are accusing Jesus and they are continuing to berate him, he does nothing. He does nothing. And he's amazed. The Bible says he marvels at how Jesus responds. Then he's amazed at the words of Jesus. When he speaks to Jesus, notice in verse 35, he says, I don't know the customs here, thine own nations, and the chief priest has delivered you. What have you done? And Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews, but now is my kingdom not from hence. And he said, are you a king then? And he said, thou sayest I'm a king, to this end was I born. For this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone that is of the truth hears my voice. And I want you to notice what Pilate responds with. He says, what is truth? Pilate is asking here, he says, you speak about testifying of the truth. What is truth? What does it even mean? I want you to put yourself in Pilate's shoes. There are some people that are like Pilate. And they are intrigued with Christ. To a degree, they hear the message of Christ. They hear of how Christ lived. They're intrigued, but yet they still come to the place where they say, we can't know. We don't know in all rational, logical thought what really is truth. And there standing before him is the way, the truth, and the life. Yet still he is at that point where he says, I don't even know what truth is. What is truth? And he went out to the Jews and he said, I don't find any fault in him. I don't find any fault. Now he tries to say, well, listen, I can release him. You know, there's a custom where you would release one, a malefactor, a criminal, on this time. And they said, we don't want Jesus. We want Barabbas. Have him come out. Barabbas was a murderer. He was a thief. But they said, we want Barabbas. Have him come out. Now, what's interesting is you're going to find as well, something else happens to Pilate. His wife, this man who's very rational, not so superstitious, he's one that's trying to judge rightly, but his wife tells him, you need to simply be done with this, because I've had dreams. I've had dreams about this man, Jesus. And she said, I just don't understand, but you need to be done with this. Don't have any power in it. Pilate is so intrigued by this. His mind that is rational and logical, and yet being faced with Jesus Christ and the message, the words of Jesus, he's amazed and he marvels and he's just shocked. And so the people, he keeps trying to get Jesus to be free. But the people now, what do? They created a massive crowd. They had these certain ones to come and say, no, we don't want it. And eventually, the Bible says that eventually the crowd wore him down. Eventually he caved. You see, with all the logic, with all the rationality, and all the reasoning, at a certain point, even a person like Pilate breaks down in the midst of the crowd screaming out. Even a person like Pilate finally says, I've just got to go with the crowd. I've got to just go ahead and do what they want. Now you listen. There are people like that all over. They see Christ, and they're intrigued by him, and they hear the message. But for some reason, in all the logic and all the reason, that type of faith, they have to brush it aside because they see the crowd. And the crowd is screaming and saying, forget Jesus, he doesn't mean anything. We don't even know if he really existed. And yet all the evidence is there, all of it. But the crowd is saying, live your life, do what you want. Doesn't matter. And that person, in all the logic, and all the, even when they look at Christ and they think to themselves, boy, there's something about him. They concede, they yield to the crowd. And that's what Pilate did. In fact, Pilate then did what? He washed his hands clean and said, my hands are clean of his blood. His blood is on your heads. And they said, oh, yes, that's fine with us. In fact, let his blood be on our heads and our children's heads. Boy, the curse in that. So, we find, though, in between this time, Pilate does what? He sends Jesus to Herod, right? Herod was a very fickle man. He was not like Pilate. In fact, he was very much opposite. He was not a nice guy, but he was also, he was the one that you read about John the Baptist, where he took Philip, his brother's wife, and John spoke against him, went against him, and so let's notice, go back with me to Luke 23. Luke 23. So we see here Pilate's struggle, but now we see Herod's mockery. Because again, what does Herod do? What happens is Herod, he was enamored when he was in ruling there in that region. He was enamored with his half-brother Herod Philip's wife. But he was also enamored with his own niece. And he was one that was very fickle and very superstitious, and he was one that, he loved pleasure, and he had imprisoned John because John spoke out against his sin and immorality. But he kind of just wanted John to be quiet and be shut up in prison, but it didn't happen that way. He ended up making a promise that he would do anything for his niece, that danced before him seductively, and boy, again, he's very emotional. And she said, I want John's head. I want John killed. So he reluctantly has him killed. Beheads John. But then you'll read in Luke 9 that he starts to hear about Jesus and the things that Jesus did. And he gets a little, again, you're talking about a superstitious, kind of a wicked, corrupt individual, but he says he believes now that John has actually risen from the dead. because he hears all the things that Jesus is doing and preaching, and he says, my goodness, this has to be John. I mean, I thought I killed him, and he's come back. And now he's so intrigued, he wants to meet Jesus. He wants to meet him. He hears the miracles Jesus has done, and boy, he really is so excited. Again, this man of superstition. I want you to look in Luke 23, and let's notice here. It says in verse 7, and as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at that time. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was so happy, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season. For a long time, Herod wanted to see Jesus. He heard about him, and he heard about all the things he did, and he said, oh, goody, I get to see Jesus. Oh, I get to see a miracle. I want to see something. But instead of a sign, there was silence. You understand that? He wanted a miracle, he wanted a sign, but there was silence. It says here, in verse 8, when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad. He was desirous to see him of a long season, because he heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. And he questioned him with many words. But Jesus answered him nothing. Now you think about that. Are there people like that as well? Some very superstitious, very emotional, and living the lives for themselves, and they're not so rational or logical, but boy, they hear something so amazing, and they've got to see it. I just got to see it. And boy, you hear about Jesus Christ and what Christ can do and the miracles, and you don't really care about the spiritual things. You just want to see something amazing happen. Or I just want to see a big thing. And when it doesn't, the people that oftentimes are the most emotional and desirous to see those things, when it doesn't happen, they become the most critical. The most critical. When the good times don't happen, when they say, I'm going to try Jesus out, or I'm going to try him out. Jesus said that when the four soils, with some that will spring up, and they say, I believe. But all of a sudden the sun comes out and starts to burn a little bit, scorch them. They get into some problems, trouble. And what do? They say, it isn't worth it. Jesus doesn't matter. It's not enough. And they begin to disdain what they desire. There's people like that. Well, I tried Jesus. He didn't do anything for me. Well, I tried this Christian thing. But it just doesn't work. It doesn't matter. Maybe it's because of the attitude they had in the heart. When they came, they said, Jesus, dance for me, Jesus. Entertain me, Jesus. Do what I want, Jesus. You understand? And if you come to that place, boy, you're going to be sorely disappointed. We treat him like a spare tire. We treat him like the bellhop boy. Jesus, help me, Jesus. Well, he's silent. He says nothing. Nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood vehemently accusing him. And Herod with his men of war set him at naught. They mocked him. They treated him with contempt. They put him in a robe. They said, okay, you want to be a king? Fine. Now they beat him. They spit upon him. They mocked. And then they sent him back to Pilate, said, I can't do anything. He doesn't speak to me. He didn't really do, just free him, I guess. And what's interesting is that Pilate did not like Herod before, but now they become good friends. And this is interesting because it almost reveals what's going to happen later, the persecution that Christianity will face under Judaism and the Roman government. But then we see, the final thing is this. I want you to look again in Luke 23 and look with me in verse 32. Now, Christ is being crucified. And there are so many. You're going to read there in Luke that there are many women that are weeping over Jesus, and they lament. And the wording there is that they actually sing a funeral song. He's going to his death. It's hopeless. That's it. And Jesus actually will turn to those ladies and he'll tell them, he says, as he's bearing the cross and going on to there to Calvary, he says, don't weep for me. You weep for yourselves, because Jesus knows what's coming. He knows what's coming down the road. 70 A.D., Jesus just a few decades later, He says, you weep for yourselves. Weep for your children, because the days are coming. Many will say, blessed are the women that didn't have children. And the women that had children, they're going to suffer so much. And they're going to cry out and say, let the hills fall on us, the mountains fall on us. And then Jesus will say in Luke 23, verse 31, for if they do these things in a green tree, what shall be done in the dry? And what he's saying is, if they're doing this now to me, in this time when it seems like all seems to be at peace, what do you think the Romans will do later? When there's so much corruption, what they do, by the way, is that they destroy the temple, they ransack, they completely kill and butcher many of the Jews. There in 70 AD under Vespasian, Jesus knew what was going to happen. But I want you to notice the latter part here and we'll be finished. Look with me here in verse 32. And there were also two other malefactors. There were other criminals, thieves, led with him to be put to death. And when they were come to the place which is called Calvary, there they crucified him. And the malefactors, the criminals on the right hand and the other on the left. So you understand, at this point, Luke gives the picture there that Jesus is being crucified, but he has a thief on one side, thief on the left. A thief on the left and a thief on the right. Now we understand that there was more to this than just simply that he's being crucified between two thieves. By the way, it was prophesied in that way. But what you read in other passages, in Mark in chapter 15, in verse 32, it says, let Christ the King of Israel descend now from the cross, that we may see and believe. There were people mocking Jesus as he's dying on the cross. And they're saying, well, come down, you say you're the Christ, that we may see and believe. And they that were crucified with him reviled him. Mark records it as both of these thieves were actually mocking Jesus. You say you're the Christ. You say you can do all things. And then we read in Matthew 27 and verse 44, it says, the thieves also, which were crucified with him, cast the same in his teeth. And that the wording there, Matthew records it as that both of the thieves were mocking and ridiculing Christ while he's on the cross. But there's something interesting that we find that John will record, or that Luke records later on in this part. Because both thieves, it seems, were ridiculing. One thief does not let go of his anger. And this thief cries out and he says, if you are Christ, then save yourself and save us. You see, there's some that are like that as well. That Jesus is the last resort. Finally, at the end. And it's not in the sense, I understand there's some people that have went to the bottom of the barrel. And they finally say, I can't do anything. It's God that has to do it. And boy, we see their life is transformed. But this is not that attitude. The attitude of the one thief is he says, I want you to save me physically. He doesn't care about the spiritual things of life. He says, I want you to deliver me physically. I deserve that. You are supposed to. If you say you're the Christ, then free yourself and free me. And there are some that are so greedy and so angry. And they look and they say, well, God, if you're real, then fix my life now. Or else I won't believe. Maybe it should be the reverse. God, I believe. Whether my life is fixed, whether it seems like I get what I want, it doesn't matter. Because I believe. And you're going to see your life begin to change. But we find what happens to the next thief. Because we understand that he was also ridiculing Jesus. But something changed. I want you to notice what it says again in verse 33. And when they were come to the place which is called Calvary, there they crucified him and the malefactors, one on the right and one on the left. And then Jesus said, Father. Now understand how more powerful this is. They're ridiculing him. They're sneering at him. Both. The people that are, the crowds coming around are mocking Jesus. By the way, they're still doing that. They do it in Hollywood. They do it in music. They still do it. We let our children listen. Well, it's not that big of a thing Don't research those things, by the way. You won't sleep at night. You ought to look up some of the lyrics. You ought to look at some of the videos. I watch some of the videos, not because I don't want to see that trash, but I want to see some of the images, symbols, and some of the messages they present. And it is sickening to me, the demonic stuff that is pushed even more today than it's ever been. And Christians sit by and say, well, what do you do? You can't really say, don't rock the boat. Then we see Jesus says, there on the cross while all are mocking him, all have forsaken, he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And you think about that thief hearing Christ. And that thief says, how can here, Jesus, I've heard him. And I've seen some of the things he's done. There have been ones that have told me of Jesus. And here I am, I've been mocking him. And I deserve death. I deserve my punishment. And he says, and here this Christ who is innocent, now he says, Father, forgive them. So now we see what happens. We see in verse 39, and one of the criminals which were hanged railed on him, constantly mocking him. And he said, if you be Christ, save us. Save thyself and us. But the other answering rebuked him, saying, do you not fear God, seeing you are in the same condemnation? He says, you're suffering the same penalty. And we indeed justly, he says, we're getting what we deserve. For we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing amiss. And he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. You see that the faith that he has now. He says, I believe now. And I'm not sitting here saying, rescue me, because I did what I deserve. All I'm saying is remember me. Remember me, Jesus, when you enter into your rightful place. And Jesus says, verily I say unto you, today you shall be with me in paradise. In paradise. Now, my question is simple. What have you done with Jesus in your life? Someone like Pilate, they say we can't really know the truth. They're intrigued by the message, intrigued by Christ and his life, but they say, really, we just don't know. And eventually they're going to concede with the crowd every time because they really don't have much conviction. There are people like that. Others, they're superstitious. They're like Herod. They live a life for themselves. They want to see the miracle. They want to see the signs. They say, well, do something for me and I'll follow. And when it doesn't happen, they get even angrier and more critical. There are others that it's the last resort. That's it. They have messed their lives up and they're so angry at God and they shake their fist at God. And while they're shaking their fist at God, they're saying, God, why can't you lend a hand? But then there are those who realize they may have mocked before, but they finally come to the place where they say, I deserve what I get. I deserve it. I'm wicked. But he is innocent. And he is the King of all. And I believe and I trust. And whatever happens to me, it doesn't matter. Because I just want to follow. Remember me. And those people are the ones that will experience paradise in his kingdom. What do you do with Jesus in your life? You do like Paul says, and he says, everything else I left behind. Everything else I consider it complete garbage because I want Jesus. Only Jesus. Only Jesus. I hope you can say that. I hope you can be like that thief. What you do with Christ is you say, Lord, you're all I need. I don't care what the crowd says. I don't care what others mock and say and ridicule. I'll follow you to the end. To the end. Let's pray this morning.